Welcome to the February 22nd, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. I would like to ask for patience as we conduct our virtual meeting. There may be slight delays as we transition between speakers, presentations, and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, please send a message to the moderator, Ray. We have 2 committee reports and 3 other discussion items on our agenda today. As usual, I would ask for a focus with each discussion to allow us to get through the entire agenda. I would ask the commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of all presentations and any public comments. Finally, please be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. We start every meeting with an opportunity for the public to comment on an item not contained on the agenda. Ray, do we have any members of the public signed up to speak today?
Not off the agenda, no.
Okay, so moving on to the committee report, item C.1, this is the Strategic Planning Committee rezoning petition process. Staff provided the committee with an overview and the timeline associated with the city's current process for rezoning applications. This item is reported as information with no action required. Are there any questions or comments from commissioners? Okay. Seeing none, I will move on to item C.2, which is text change TC 1221 accessory commercial units. This is a proposal to amend Part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance to replace the existing live-work use with the accessory commercial unit use. The draft ordinance proposes standards for ACUs to regulate a number of factors in the location and operation of ACUs. The Text Change Committee reviewed the item at its meetings on December 6, January 18, and February 1, and proposed a series of revisions, including the requirement for a special use permit for ACUs, standards for how the Board of Adjustment would review requests for ACUs, limitations on use and the development of a new use called food retail, which would be allowed in ACUs, and limitation on hours of operation. The Text Change Committee voted to refer the item to the Planning Commission without a recommendation. The deadline for Planning Commission action is March 21st. Text Change Committee Chair Miller, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I'll just do a brief committee report and then hand it over to staff. As our chair mentioned, the Text Change Committee has been working on TC 1221 accessory commercial units for several meetings. And this text change amends the UDO to modify Section 6 to add the ACU or accessory commercial unit use to all residential zoning districts in the city. To achieve this goal, it also amended the UDO to remove the home occupation use and modify the live work use. It further clarifies the relationship between home business uses and accessory uses. Prior to this text change, in residential districts in the city, home occupations and live work uses that allowed employees and customers were already permitted. The key goal of this change was to expand those existing commercial uses to include food retail in order to expand access to fresh food and grocery. This text change also improves upon the existing regulations regarding live work by clarifying the type of retail that is permitted. With that, I will hand the mic over to staff.
Good morning, this is John Anagnos. I do have a presentation with a couple slides that I can go through pretty quickly. So basically, there's a few changes since this ordinance was originally written and since a couple of revisions went through the Text Change Committee. And so what you see today in the backup materials is reflecting the changes listed on this slide. So basically, the original version had removed home occupation and basically put live work in that position as a zoning permit, home business use that wouldn't require a special use permit. And so with the committee's desire to have a special use permit required for the ACU use, it made sense to add home occupation back to allow at least some very minimal home business to be allowed without going to the Board of Adjustment. So that's what the ordinance today is showing. So a zoning permit required for home occupation, and then a ACU use that is taking the place of live work would require a special use permit from the Board of Adjustment. That does come with discretionary standards that speak to excessive noise, fumes, glare, light, and traffic. And then The other aspect that I just want to note is the newly defined food retail use that was requested by the committee. And so basically that eating establishment in the committee didn't feel like was addressing the specific issue that was noted in the authorization of the text change, and that really is food retail that would address that issue of nutritional scarcity in neighborhoods. But that the retail sales use as defined in the code was too broad to also address that topic. And so we have created a definition of a new use called food retail. There's a very narrowly defined retail use, basically specifying food, beverages, and household goods, and setting very low limitations on the percentage of display area and revenue that can be generated from alcohol, tobacco, cannabis products, things of that nature. There was a request to prohibit the sale of firearms through this use. In talking with the city attorney's office, it is difficult for the city to strictly, expressly prohibit the sale of firearms. We believe that would be counter to state law that separates the power of regulating firearms between state and local government. So we did not include that. So that's what you see in the draft ordinance. And I'm happy to take any questions from the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnos. I do believe we have one member of the public signed up to speak on this item. Without objection, I would like to allow the public comment. Okay, seeing none, please unmute the speaker with 2 minutes on the clock.
Yes, Jennifer Irving Kochman, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Kochman. It's one of those terrible names. I just wanted to speak on the text changes again. The changes address all of Raleigh, but they don't provide equity to all neighborhoods. They discriminate against neighborhoods that don't offer the protection of homeowner associations, which are neighborhoods that are often older and often located in underprivileged parts of the city. If you're going to approve TC 1221, please consider the following. 1, special use permits are critical and need to be maintained for ACUs and home occupation. 2, new businesses must provide at least 1 parking spot. Section E, number 15, eliminates all parking requirements, yet the new changes add a total of 7 employees and customers per business who will be competing with residential parking in residentially zoned neighborhoods. This is totally impractical. It'll create parking mayhem, and it goes way too far in favoring business over residents. 3, reduces suggested operating hours to 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., which are normal business hours in sync with public parking permit hours. And finally, the text change committee unanimously voted to ban all alcohol, tobacco, vaping, gun, and firearm sales in residential neighborhoods outright, but there's not an outright ban that's reflected in this revised version. Even though the city can't regulate alcohol or firearms, it can certainly keep them from operating in residential neighborhoods where children live and play by striking them from all allowable retail sales in this ordinance, which does not provide a total ban outright right now. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Just checking, there are no other members of the public signed up to speak. Is that correct?
Correct, just one.
Okay. All right. Moving on to questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Miller?
To address some of Ms. Kochman's comments, I wanted to first thank her for attending these text change committee meetings and providing helpful review and feedback. And I did just want to address, I know that this topic has been widely followed, so I did want to address a couple other of the key findings from the committee. One of this text, and I wanted to iterate, this text change has gone through a number of significant changes since we saw the initial draft that I think has been reported on. Initially, there was going to be significantly more retail uses other than just food retail that were expanded in these ACUs. And under the initial draft, we also had removed the special use permit, which removed all ACUs and live work from being subject to review by the Board of Adjustment for subjective findings such as that this use did not provide undue impacts on the neighbors regarding light, sound, noise, smells, and the other concerns that neighbors frequently have. So one thing, so based on a lot of these concerns, we asked staff to perform some research, and we identified that basically we identified what the key concerns might be. Those included increasing crime by bringing in neighbors or visitors generally, plus expanding, allowing for alcohol sales, tobacco, firearms. It could potentially decrease the housing supply. It could create parking problems and create quality of life concerns about appropriate hours, smells, parking, et cetera. So based on those concerns, we had to evaluate and balance the competing interests, and we decreased the number of hours. We put back in the special use permits. We created standards that the Board of Adjustment should have to review for all of these uses. And we also limited to the extent we legally are allowed to, or as a city, limited the sale of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. So that there will be no such thing as sort of a vape shop or a gun store or a beer store, that kind of thing. And also by decreasing the number of hours, we also, they were initially open until 11 p.m. We peeled that back to, I want to double, is it 7 or 8 p.m.? I realized it's not off the top. Oh, to significantly earlier, let me double check the time.
Sorry.
Till 8 p.m., excuse me. And with the goal of avoiding some of the crime issues that we were concerned about previously. So based on those concerns, we created a number of changes in order to, again, try to expand the food retail option to potentially address some of the food desert issues throughout the city.
Thank you, Commissioner Miller. Are there any other questions or comments from staff or from commissioners? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So the rationale for this text change is to expand access to fresh food. It seems like it's expanding access to everything but fresh food. I mean, how does this ensure that it's expanding access to fresh food? It seems like neighborhoods are getting access to a lot more. I'm just trying to understand how it seems like there are other ways to expand access to fresh, healthy foods and address food deserts than allowing your neighbor to sell alcohol, firearms, tobacco. I don't think I support this. It feels like it does a lot more than the very good goal that it's intended to address. I think the other consequences of this might be something we don't want to have to deal with.
Thank you for your comment. Is staff available to provide a little bit of clarity about the uses which will be allowed in the current draft? I know we went through many iterations. If you could speak specifically to food retail and which uses are allowed.
Sure, this is John Anagnost again. The allowed uses in the current draft of TC 1221 are basically the same as what's currently allowed in live work, with the exception of the food retail use, because that's a newly created use. But after the committee review, basically we had previously had broadened the range of uses that would have been allowed in the ACU compared to live work to include retail sales as a general category instead of just specific retail sales, a larger set of indoor recreation and personal service uses. So all that has been pared back to essentially what's currently allowed in live work plus food retail, and food retail having that narrow definition. And so the indoor recreation uses that are specifically allowed are basically instructional studios or classrooms, so musical instruction, sports instruction. So you couldn't have like a reception venue, things like that. And personal service similarly kind of focus on a very narrow set of allowed uses. So it is intended to be the types of uses that would normally customarily be associated with a home business.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Miller?
Commissioner Bennett's comments are well taken. I did want to add that we addressed and tackled some of these same issues. Some of our other findings, the initial policy goal stated by council and why they wanted ACUs was to alleviate food deserts. So our first meeting was spent diving into that policy goal and some of the research behind it. What we found is that the concept of adding ACUs throughout every residential zoning district has never been done in any city nationwide, and it's never been offered as a solution to addressing or alleviating food deserts. We had staff overlap the maps on where the existing federally recognized food deserts are in the city with our existing zoning map and found that much of the food deserts already overlap with mixed-use districts. So where this type of commercial activity is already allowed. So in fact, expanding commercial zoning has not been shown to alleviate food deserts already in Raleigh or elsewhere in the city. And since the USDA definition of food deserts only it is determined by access to large format grocery stores, allowing small retail would not alleviate that problem. And further, given the fact that the commercial code for operating restaurants would require significant infrastructure that would not really be feasible or reasonable in these small ACUs, it's far more likely that this is going to be prepackaged food and not fresh food, although it's conceivably possible that some people might be able to bake cookies or that kind of thing and sell them. This is not, probably not what will be expanded here. So, and the other thing that we found is when we polled cities trying to figure out if we could do some kind of a pilot program, that when it comes to zoning and our zoning code, pilot programs are highly problematic because we cannot, once somebody complies with the zoning code and creates some new commercial activity, they, even if we change the zoning code thereafter, if it becomes problematic, anything that was created while that rule was in effect would be grandfathered in, so it can't really be undone. So instead, we evaluated if there were any specific neighborhoods that specifically wanted this, and the city conducted a further survey at our request to see which neighborhoods might want this, and the closest we came is I believe there was one zip code where there were 2 people who said they wanted it. So for all of those reasons, I certainly understand what the concerns are. However, again, so we had to figure out how we moved forward from that. So what this text change does, again, there were a number of uses that were initially allowed that we peeled back to purely limit this to food sales. And while we cannot eliminate all tobacco or alcohol being sold there, we could limit it significantly under the definition of food retail. So that was how we addressed that problem. And in addition, the initial draft was going to remove the special use permits even for live work, which again already exist and provide some limited retail sales and allow for employees and customers. And so what we did, and the initial draft proposed to remove the special use permit. And again, the special use permit process takes the case through the Board of Adjustment and expands it provides public notice to the neighbors and creates a subjective review on whether the new use creates an undue impact to the neighbors. So we thought it was not appropriate to remove that special use permit, so we added it back in. So when we look at the actual effect of this text change, it is purely to allow a new use that's called food retail to all of the existing live work uses that already exist in residential areas, and to require the special use permit to do the additional subjective review that's already happening with the other live work uses that exist in these neighborhoods. So what this might do would be to allow for food retail to exist while not actually changing the existing commercial uses in residential districts significantly. That being said, there are still policy concerns that commissioners might have and might choose to vote against it, and I can see both sides of that.
Commissioner Lampman?
Commissioner Miller, that was a fantastic overview. Thank you for that. So does this support primarily, like if someone were to operate a food business out of their home? Is that what this is intended? What's the look? What can I visualize as a who's the avatar here of who would start this?
Well, the way this is currently written, it would allow a wide range of sort of internally facing home businesses, office type businesses, things of that nature. But the goal of the city council authorization was to allow more businesses that would have more of an external focus, more of attracting pass-by customers, maybe not by appointment, and in particular restaurants and retailers that sell food items. So restaurants are no longer allowed in this current draft. So really it would be limited to, in terms of what this ordinance would do that would further the goals expressed by the city council, it would be to enable someone to have a retail shop operating out of their home that would sell primarily food, beverages, and household goods. And the intent would be people living in the neighborhood, instead of getting in a car and driving to the nearest drugstore or grocery store or gas station, might instead walk down the street to this retail establishment.
Commissioner Lampman?
Thank you for that overview as well. I actually love this. I think that it provides opportunity to really small folks that want to start a business. I think that there are too many barriers to entry. I think it allows people to, provide commerce with neighbors. And to address the comments provided earlier by the public, I apologize, I can't remember her name, but she had mentioned that this would benefit, that this doesn't protect neighbors without homeowners associations, but I actually think that could be a really great thing. And I think actually homeowners associations may be detrimental because they prohibit a lot of businesses. So I'm actually really excited about this. Thank y'all for digging into this so deeply.
Thank you, Commissioner Lampman. Do we have any additional questions or comments? Commissioner O'Haver?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Chair Fox. A couple of questions, and then I'll just kind of let everybody know where I think I'm standing depending on these. So in my simplified mind, what I'm hearing John say are two important things, that we're essentially taking the live work designation and creating it to ACU. And the difference is, the primary difference, I think there's some other minor differences, is allowing food retail. So that's my first sort of question I'd like confirmation on. And my second question is, Commissioner Miller mentioned that nowhere else in the country has a community tried this before. So are ACUs allowed in every residential district? Is live work allowed now in every single residential district? Those are my two questions. Then I have some follow-up.
Yeah, I think that summary of adding food retail is the most significant difference between the ACU and the live work that's currently in the code. There are a few new site design standards that we've added to ACU that don't apply to live work currently. So things like screening of mechanical equipment, those things were largely oriented towards when this was considering eating establishment or restaurant uses that would likely have a larger footprint of mechanical equipment outside of the building. but those things are still there. So if there was, something associated with food retail, that would be screened, and then additional standards for signage and lighting, those kind of things. And then your second question was, has anyone else? Oh, is live work currently allowed in all residential districts? Yes, if the Board of Adjustment grants a special use permit. Yes.
So that's the same. That's essentially the same as what, because we put the SUP back in. Originally, we had taken it out. So what I'm hearing is this is pretty much allowed with some minor tweaks, other than we're adding the potential for food retail, which wasn't currently allowed. By your silence, I'll assume that's correct. So I think I was, to be honest, I was leaning the other way. I mean, I think y'all know I've generally been in support of this. I think at the very first meeting, I rattled off a handful of current examples in town that are already successful. I do think that through the text change committee and the lead of Commissioner Miller, I think there have been many significant changes, and that the code has drastically improved from what we first looked at. Certainly, the sale of firearms is something that would jump out to all of us, but I think that's a little bit out of our control. I was a little concerned that there just was maybe too many potential unintended consequences, but I think after listening to the rest of this conversation, I'm in support of this text change.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Haver. Do we have any additional questions or comments? Commissioner Bennett, and then Commissioner Dautel.
What type of regulations would there be on specifically the food retail, and people cooking food in their homes and selling it? How is that regulated to ensure that it's safe to eat?
Those things will be regulated by the Wake County Department of Environmental Health and Safety. So the agency that you think of when you see the sanitation score at a restaurant, the score out of 100 that's posted on the wall, usually behind the cash register. So they, that would apply to, there is a limited amount of prepared food that is allowed in this food retail use. Again, eating establishment or restaurant would not be allowed in the ACU, but the definition of food retail does indicate that some percentage of their sales and display area could be prepared, ready-to-eat food, and that would probably entail some cooking equipment, things of that nature. And so those things would have to pass a sanitation inspection annually. Also, any equipment of that nature would have to pass an initial inspection from Wake County Environmental Health and Safety when the business is first permitted. And then there are also some commercial building code requirements that come into play at that point, depending on the scale of the equipment being envisioned for the prepared food.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Dautel.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Fox. I think for me, one of my main concerns throughout the process was the potential addition of the sale of alcohol, tobacco, vaping products, firearms into residential neighborhoods. So I think it would be helpful, maybe staff could kind of outline sort of those elements, what and how much was allowed under the previous or current live work use, and what would be different under the ACU standards for the sale of those things.
The current live work use does not allow retail sales in general. It allows and this is what is odd about the current live work standards, is that they don't draw upon the existing definitions elsewhere in the zoning code. They kind of create this custom set of allowed uses that is unique to that particular live work use. And so that's one of the things we've tried to correct with this ordinance, is to tie the allowed uses in ACU to uses that are defined elsewhere in the code. So, I mean, to answer your question, the retail sales in live work is pretty much limited to, the types of goods that are allowed to be prepared or produced otherwise in a live work. So things like jewelry, clothing, electronics, those kind of things. That was sort of what was envisioned in live work, where you could resell those things because the proprietor of that live work is repairing them or producing them, manufacturing them, and so you could have a patron come and purchase those things at the home business. So adding food retail is a pretty major expansion of the retail sales, because it is basically saying many of the, the range of retail sales that you might expect from a convenience store, with the exception of the degree of alcohol and tobacco, because that's typically fairly large for convenience stores, but that you would have a wide range of products that are not related to somebody producing them on site or repairing them on site. They would primarily be products bought from a wholesaler and resold through this retail establishment. So it is essentially a new form of retail that would be enabled by ACU, food retail.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Bennett?
Just one final question, comment, I think. I'm absolutely in support of helping small businesses. I think that's great. This just feels very problematic to me. And I'm wondering, why don't we just help people establish neighborhood businesses versus doing this out of their homes? It seems like we could invest time and energy in helping someone open up a small neighborhood retail food business that would be I don't know, it just seems like I can't imagine. I'm looking out my window, my neighbor selling food, and a beer, next door as the school buses are going by. That just seems like not what we're trying to do to address people's access to fresh food. It's problematic for me. I don't think it is achieving the goal, the very admirable goal that it has. I also see the potential for equity issues. I see the potential for lots of issues with this. I just think there are ways to address this other than this way.
Your points are heard. Commissioner Lampman, did you have your hand up?
I was just kind of thinking through some of those things too, and I can appreciate some of the thoughts about where there would be some concern. I think I also see some of the opportunity. I think the number of business permits that went through this past couple of years has been astounding. I think that it creates, I know a number of, minority-owned businesses have popped up all over, and folks can't necessarily afford to get office space or retail space. And I think that there is so much opportunity here to reduce the barriers to entry that, a lot of the large convenience stores are people who can afford the commercial space. I'm very maybe Pollyanna about it, but I feel like there's just tremendous opportunities that maybe, I think maybe your neighbor might have, or a neighbor might have, an Etsy establishment, and this now just allows them to allow someone to come up to the door and create a transaction. So I think that there's a lot of good that can come out of this. And yeah, there might be some, regulation, additional oversight, or, but I think a lot of that is already taken care of through the permitting and business establishments and food inspection, health inspection. So I'm very optimistic about this, and I'm excited about it.
Thank you, Commissioner Lampman. Commissioner Miller?
I think this is a great discussion. There are competing policy interests, and I can see both sides of them, and I understand if there will be a split vote on this case, and that may well deserve that. But with that, I would like to make a motion. I move to approve TC 1221 accessory commercial units. The text change is consistent with the comprehensive plan and overall, and is reasonable and in the public interest.
And Commissioner Lampman?
Second?
Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve TC 1221. Commissioner Lampman has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Morning. Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Nay.
Commissioner Dontel?
I just want to say, I think that the staff and Commissioner Miller and the Text Change Committee have done a good job trying to make this as good as it could possibly be, but I'm still going to vote nay.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Hare?
Much to my chagrin, again, I've really been on the fence here. I was leaning towards support. After hearing some more of that additional conversation, I think I'm gonna dip my toe back on the other side and say, nay, I don't think it's accomplishing the initial objective from council. So sorry to be wish-washy to my fellow commissioners, but I've been on the fence on this one. Nay.
The motion passes on a narrow 4-3 vote. In terms of summarizing concerns commissioners may have, it's the competing policy goals, unintended consequences, and some of the uses that are permitted. Is there anything else you'd like to add to my summary? No? Okay.
I believe it was also not furthering the policy interest of providing fresh food.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving on to old business, there are 2 items listed under the old business portion of the agenda today. These items have been previously discussed and we have received presentations and heard from the public. So we will begin each with a short update from staff, focusing on the revisions to the request. The first item, D.1, is case number Z6620 or TCZ 420. This is a request to amend the zoning conditions for a 13.38 acre portion of the Crabtree Village Plan Development on the block bounded by Homewood Banks Drive, Blue Ridge Road, and Crabtree Valley Avenue. This case was discussed during the January 25th, 2022 meeting and was deferred to allow the applicant and transportation staff to coordinate on traffic safety mitigation solutions. The applicant has revised the request to include a requirement to install support equipment for a traffic control device at the intersection of Crabtree Valley Avenue and Homewood Banks Drive, or to pay an equivalent fee in lieu if installation is not possible. I'd like to ask for a staff update from Ira Mabel.
Yep. Thank you, Chair Fox, Ira Mabel. That was basically everything I had to say. We can jump to the next slide and we can go over some specifics. So just as a reminder, this is part of an existing plan development that includes the Market Crabtree and covers just the remaining part of what's known as Kids Hill, highlighted in yellow there. And we are directly south of Crabtree Valley Mall. Next slide. So the staff report last time had listed some concerns from transportation staff about the safety of the Crabtree Valley Avenue, Homeward Banks Drive intersection, and the ability of staff to request or perhaps require improvements to that intersection because of explicit language in the PD that said that would not be permitted. So this is what basically my slides from last time of the summary of that language, and we can go to the next slide. So that language has been removed and replaced with some description. And again, this is a summary, but installation of part of the infrastructure needed for a traffic signal at that location. So this was a compromise after much negotiation between the applicant and staff about what would be appropriate and helpful to mitigate the concern there. So I think all parties are satisfied that this is reasonable and beneficial to the public in terms of the safety of that intersection. Next slide, please. So I'd be happy to go over the details of that. I think transportation staff is also available should you have questions about how that might work. And then I believe the only other unanswered question last time commissioners had was about the plantings along some of the new retaining walls. So the applicant has submitted a new version of the site plan attached to this case and shows some new plantings there. I could not begin to tell you what all those letters mean for what the trees are, but I trust the people who care probably do, and the applicant can probably answer questions, but definitely more detail in the planting plan here. Next slide, please. So note the consistency for the case hasn't changed, always consistent with the plan and the map, the future land use map, and consistent with urban form. Next slide. This list of policies is all the same. Next slide, please. And these new ones were added. So the original staff report, because of that language specifying no more improvements to the right of way, these policies were inconsistent. And so with the changes, they have flipped to consistent. Next slide shows them being removed from there. So really just a couple of policies about design standards that remain. Next slide, please. Your deadline for action is in a couple days. So you either need to recommend approval or denial of this case or request an extension. I'd be happy to answer any questions this time.
Thank you, Mr. Mabel. Now I'd like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner O'Haver.
Thank you, Chair Fox. I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated February 22nd, 2022, containing the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment for cases E6620, TCZ 420. After considering the policies, maps, and other materials included as part of the comprehensive plan, I feel that the proposed zoning amendment is consistent with the comprehensive plan and other adopted plans and consistent with the future land use map, and the request should be approved. The action taken is reasonable and in the public interest because of the consistent policies, LU 1.2, future land use map and zoning consistency, LU 5.1, reinforcing the urban pattern, LU 6.1, composition of mixed use centers, LU 8.10, infill development.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Dautel?
Second.
Commissioner O'Haver has offered a motion to approve Z6620 or TCZ 420. Commissioner Dautel has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dautel?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
I'm sorry, I would also like to, before I vote, thank the applicant for working with staff and staff being available to the applicant to come to a mutual agreement on this. So I want to thank both parties for that. And with that, I vote aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item D.2, which is case number Z6820. This is a request to rezone approximately 0.2 acres at a portion of the parcel located at 1624 Glenwood Avenue from commercial mixed use 3 stories urban general conditional use to commercial mixed use 3 stories conditional use. This item was discussed at the January 27th Committee of the Whole meeting, where the committee voted unanimously to vote the item out of committee with no recommendation in order to allow the applicant time to revise zoning conditions. The applicant has submitted revised conditions. And so we will start with an update from Hannah Reckow.
Good morning. As was just mentioned, the applicant has added some zoning conditions, so we can go to the next slide to take a look at those. So conditions 2, 3, and 4 are new. Condition 2 prohibits some uses normally permitted in CX district. Condition 3 prohibits drive-through facilities, and the final condition requires screening of dumpsters on the site. Next slide. So the new conditions improved consistency, addressed some of the issues with the inconsistency, but there are still some inconsistent issues that remain. Neighborhood mixed use zoning district, which is what aligns most closely with the neighborhood mixed use future land use map designation, also includes some significant limited use standards on bar restaurant uses that curve the impacts of that use. And so without conditions that pertain to that, the request is still inconsistent with the future land use map. Next slide. And then there was no change in the consistency as well with the future land use map, or sorry, urban form map. Next slide. And so just as a reminder, the case is still inconsistent overall. Go to the next slides, just as a reminder of the policies, consistent policies, and then the inconsistent policies as well. So that summarizes the update on the case and the consistency. I want to make a note also at the last meeting, it discussed the issue of fire access to the property to the south. I believe we do have staff from the fire department that's available to answer questions about that. But I just wanted to say a few things about that situation. It's my understanding that the property owner at 1622 Glenwood Ave is currently in the process of getting permits for an addition that they built sort of after the fact. Part of that is demonstrating adequate fire service to that structure. Hypothetically, that could come off of Glenwood Ave, but the alleyway and the new addition is too far away for that structure to be served via Glenwood Ave, but there are a number of other ways that they could meet that. My understanding is also they could go get access at Fairview Road, which would require a cross-access agreement. They could also sprinkler their building, and then they could also remove the new addition. The last thing I'll say to that is that this rezoning request does not change the ability for a structure to be built on the subject site and block, hypothetically, cross-access from Fairview Road. That is something that is permitted under the current zoning and would also be permitted under the requested zoning. So like I said, we have Ryan Cutright from Fire Department who's available to answer any other questions you might have. Also, happy to answer any questions you have about the case.
Thank you, Ms. Reckow. I'd like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Miller?
Thank you. And thank you, Hannah, for that update. I know that I've spoken or had some communication with the applicant and some with the neighbors as well about this issue. And so that's helpful to gain more information about the fire access from staff, from Hannah. And I was going to see if just wanted to confirm with staff from the fire department that what the other options are. I understand extensions were built for outdoor seating and dining during the pandemic. And so if there's just an issue for this back patio, or if there's an issue for all of the neighbors to the south as well, with respect to having access to fire services.
Yeah, this is Ryan Cutright with the Fire Marshal's Office. So the occupants of 1622 built an enclosed addition onto the building. When they replaced their deck, they added about 400 square feet onto the building for additional bar indoor seating. In order to meet the current requirements of the fire code, they could either put a sprinkler system in the building or provide a cross-access agreement to have access in the future to Fairview Drive across 1624. So those were the options that they have at this point. It wouldn't have been as big of an issue if they would have done this before. If they would have got the permits first, it would have resolved a lot of these questions.
Thank you. And what about the other neighbors to the south? Is there an issue with any of those also receiving adequate access to fire services?
I don't think they currently, none of the other property owners currently have cross-access agreements across anybody else's property. So from the fire code standpoint and the building code standpoint, we could not deny another property owner any permits of construction on their property that would block access from the current parking lots in the back. I'm not aware of any of the other properties back there. We haven't looked at any of those. We've just been examining 1622 and their issues of access with this addition without permits and how they need to go about meeting the fire code and building code.
Understood. So development of this area would not, you were saying that access to Fairview would be, they could have cross-access agreements with other properties to the south?
I only know of 1622 could only get access, I believe, across 1624. That would provide them with the proper hose pool length and hydrant distances according to the fire code.
Okay. And they might have further access back there as well. And so one quick additional question for staff, just wanted to clarify. Under the existing zoning for the applicant, would they be permitted to develop this property as well without providing an easement?
Without providing an easement? The current zoning doesn't require them to provide an easement.
And no other requirement, right? So this rezoning request doesn't actually change what could be developed, whether this property, the applicant's property, could be developed?
I'm going to just take a look in the staff report for the existing conditions.
Yeah, there are existing conditions that limit the uses and the total buildable area, but there is no limit on, there's no requirement that speaks to an easement or the location of a building.
So I guess the question is, Hannah, what is the limit, current limit on building footprint?
I'm going to bring up the is 10,000 square feet total.
10,000?
And a building footprint of around 5,000 square feet.
Is that inclusive of the current building or? Because it's one lot.
This is a portion of the property, so
Okay.
it's just to the portion of the property that has the
Well,
name in the parking lot on it.
so the total building area you said is limited to 10,000 square feet?
That's right.
That's larger than the site that's being rezoned, isn't it? I think the answer to the question is, and maybe the applicant can provide further clarification, is that it would be permissible under the current zoning to place a structure on the property such that it would eliminate that access.
Yes, I agree with that.
Like what I was driving at was whether or not the limitation on the building size would limit to a size that would be physically impossible for a building of that size to block the access. It sounds like the allowance is easily large enough to allow for a building to block the access and still meet the square footage requirements of the current conditions.
Yes, I'll just add, when staff did the envision tomorrow analysis to estimate the build outs, the total build out did not change very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So just to clarify that point, the under the existing zoning, the applicant could develop the property such that it would not allow sort of fire access to the south. So this rezoning application is not trying to newly eliminate the applicant's right to do so.
That is correct. They can currently build a structure that could block cross access. They could as well do that in the requested zoning.
Thank you.
Thank you for that information. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Bennett?
Excuse me, thank you. I'm trying to just kind of bottom line this for myself because I thought I was coming in really clear, and all the discussion has kind of got me a little confused. So it seems to me that the conversation around fire access, there's an issue because the neighboring property added an addition without getting the permit, and that created the issue. Okay, so for me, and maybe I'm making this too simple, that property owner is responsible for fixing the issue, not this applicant, because this applicant didn't do anything. So I don't feel like we should impose any type of condition or restriction on this property owner because the neighboring property owner did something without getting the proper permit from the city. Let that property owner take care of it. And I'm just focusing on the merits of this rezoning, independent of what that neighbor has done, because that neighbor needs to handle that. Am I oversimplifying it? Or maybe I am, but that's how I'm looking at it. So the fire access issue is not an issue for me because it doesn't seem to be relevant to this rezoning. It seems to be the neighbor's issue to deal with. So that's where I am. If I'm wrong, I'll just be wrong, but that's where I am on this one.
Commissioner Bennett, I believe your summary was pretty accurate and reflects my own opinions as well. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Miller?
I would say it sounds like there is some open question about once this property is developed, just some cross access from Fairview to several of the other neighbors to the south. However, that being said, under the existing zoning, the applicant would be permitted to develop this property without providing cross-access to the neighbors. So this zoning request does not actually change that. So with that, I would like to make a motion to approve this rezoning case. However, I'd like to add a recommendation that council do further investigation into the fire access to the neighbors to the south. And add that this, and I'd also, with that addition to my motion, I would like to also adopt the proposed consistency statement dated February 22nd, 2022, contained in the agenda materials. And this recommendation also includes an amendment to the future land use map to the extent described in the adopted consistency statement.
Second.
Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve case number Z6821. Commissioner Mann has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanita for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell,
Aye.
Chair Fox,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
and Commissioner O'Haver.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the new business portion of the agenda. This request has not appeared on a previous Planning Commission agenda, and we will hear a full staff presentation and applicant presentation. The item is item number E.1, case number Z7821. This is a request to rezone approximately 1.22 acres in the block bounded by Dawson Street, Martin Street, Davie Street, and Commerce Place from downtown mixed-use 5-story shopfront and downtown mixed-use 12 stories shopfront conditional use to downtown mixed-use 20 stories conditional use. I'd like to start with a staff presentation from Matt Glenn.
Good morning, Chair Fox and members of the Planning Commission. Thank you for the introduction and laying out the case. Your deadline is April 8th to make a recommendation to the City Council. You can see the zoning in the area here is predominantly downtown mixed use with permitted building heights ranging from 5 to 40 stories within the adjacent blocks. And then if you look in the southwest corner of the zoning map there, you see some purple industrial mixed use zoning. Next slide. Oh, just covered that. Next slide. So an aerial view of the site. This is in the block bounded by those streets the chair mentioned. There are 2 existing structures on Martin Street. The balance of the properties under request are surface parking with a drive aisle connecting to Davie Street. You can see to the west Raleigh Union Station, Nash Square, and the block to the northeast. This is located in the Depot District. Next slide. Here are the existing structures. Next slide. Another view of them on Martin Street looking down Commerce Place. Next slide. And this is on Commerce Place in Davie, looking at that tail property line that was shown on the aerial map. This building is not included in the request. Next slide. And looking again at the site from Dawson Street. Next slide. So several zoning conditions. What these zoning conditions do is essentially require the preservation of those existing structures, which are contributing structures to the Depot National Register District, preserving the first 85 feet of those structures, allowing for the removal of the rear portions of the structures. They're about 120 some feet deep, so that those rear portions can be removed. These zoning conditions also prohibit floors above those existing structures, which is permitted under the existing zoning. So what is proposed is that no additional stories can be added to those contributing structures. Next slide. This is kind of what that looks like. So that's about 85 feet of that front structure to be maintained, so that rear portion could be demolished. Next slide. This condition lays out what can happen if by some calamity those structures are destroyed by more than 50% of the replacement cost. So if that occurs, the structures can be removed and they can be replaced with 5-story structures. There are currently 2. And those replacement structures have to be constructed with similar materials to those other materials found within contributing structures of the Depot National Register District. Next slide. These zoning conditions prohibit certain uses. They provide for a dog waste station to be included on the property, and also require that a public plaza be provided on the site, and half of that plaza is open to the public. Next slide. So this is comparing the existing built entitlement to the proposed entitlement. There are actually some reductions. You'll see about 14 less units of housing permitted under the proposed zoning, and similar reductions in office and retail. That is essentially because the additional stories gained from 12 to 20 and new structures essentially in the center of the block where that surface parking is not accounting for the loss of additional stories above the 2-story structure under current zoning conditions. So there is a modest reduction in entitlement here. Next slide. So in terms of transportation and energy analysis, this is in downtown, so extremely walkable, extremely bikeable, transit access, among the best areas in the city. It is on the downtown grid. There is shopping, dining, grocery stores nearby, and employment opportunities. So the transportation cost index is low, actually, or I'm sorry, is high, which means that transportation costs are very low. So living in this area means you spend less money on transportation because you can walk and bike and take transit to run your errands. So that reduces the overall cost of living. Job proximity index is high, which means there are lots of job opportunities in the area. So if a residential project is built here, if someone lives in this new development, they will spend less money traveling from place to place because they are more likely to walk or bike, and they can walk and bike to a wide variety of job opportunities. Next slide. So just showing all of the transit in the area. Of course, Raleigh Union Station is about 2 blocks away. The future site of Rust Bus, which will be the BRT hub for the southern and western BRT routes. So again, excellent transit access and walkability today, and of course, improvements for better transit in the future as well with BRT. Next slide. So housing units goes down by 14. So decreases potential supply, does not include any subsidized units. but of course, those other affordability metrics score well. Next slide. Demographic indicators here, so very close to a lot of the city, except for the linguistically isolated population. Otherwise, on par with the rest of the city, generally speaking. Next slide. The request is consistent with the community mixed use designation. While the request is for downtown mixed use, the prohibited uses are limited, or the permitted uses are limited to those that would be consistent with this designation. The height is beyond what the LU2 table would otherwise recommend, but because of the basically shuffling that same entitlement, we looked at how the entitlement is actually reduced by concentrating that in the center of the block. It is consistent generally with what this designation would otherwise recommend. Next slide. The request does not include an urban frontage, so it is inconsistent with the recommendations of the urban form map. There's an error on this slide, my apologies. So there is not an urban frontage, and so it is inconsistent with the urban form map. Next slide. So consistent with the plan overall, consistent with the future land use map, inconsistent with the urban form map, which would require a frontage. There's not one included in the request. Next slide. And just looking at the policies, consistent with these policies again, capitalizing on transit access, great transit in the area. It's in the close proximity to Rusk Bus and Raleigh Union Station. Zoning conditions are preserving the existing contributing structures, most of them on the site. Next slide. Again, looking at mitigating impacts on historic sites by keeping those structures intact. Next slide. Inconsistent with frontage because there's not one included, and inconsistent with zoning for housing, that reduction in housing on the property, in the entitlement, and small area plan, downtown West Gateway, inconsistent with the height guidance of that policy as well. Next slide. No outstanding issues. This is your deadline, and I believe there's one more slide. Yeah. So Raleigh Historic Development Commission reviewed and supports the rezoning application in a vote of 10-0, with the statement that they encourage the applicants to follow the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation work on historic structures or any new construction on the site. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Clem. Now I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in favor have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Chair Fox and members of the Commission. I'm Jamie Schrader with Parker Poe at 301 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of the applicant. Also on the line are Jason Davis with Turnbridge Equities and Fred Belladin with Clearscapes. This site may be familiar to some of you as part of a 2018 zoning led by the late Steve Schuster, Clearscapes founder. The proposed case today captures Steve's vision, but includes additional portions allowing greater height mid-block to allow for the significant amount of growth downtown is experiencing. Next slide, please. As Matt explained, the site is comprised of two parcels within the National Register Historic District and the Depot District. The two structures fronting West Martin Street are contributing structures to this district, and much of our case is centered around trying to carry forward the significant historic preservation conditions that Steve envisioned. The purpose of the rezoning is to allow for additional height and vertical construction on the portion of the site currently used for surface parking, while including and honoring these substantial historic preservation components, which preserve the character of the downtown warehouse district. Based on those conditions, we received unanimous support from the RHDC. Next slide, please. Turnbridge Equities is partnering with the former partners of Clearscapes to bring this project forward. Turnbridge formed a relationship with Clearscapes from their work together at the Creamery and other projects in Raleigh and in Durham. And this is now the second case that Turnbridge has brought before the RHDC and this commission, following the Creamery on Glenwood Avenue. And like the Creamery, shown on the right of the screen, with new construction in the background, the site lends itself to preserving historic structures located along the edge of a strong pedestrian corridor on Martin Street. Other examples of their work in Austin are shown to the left, and they illustrate Turnbridge's ability to contextualize design specific to locations. Next slide, please. The existing zoning on 307 West Martin Street is shown here in blue and was explained at DX12 as Shopfront CU. 310 Dawson, which is the new site that's added in, is highlighted in yellow and is zoned DX5 Shopfront. However, the surrounding area is growing quickly, and to meet that growing need for office, residential, and tech space in downtown Raleigh, we've brought forth the following case. Next slide, please. We are proposing a DX20 conditional use district with designation of conditions very similar to the 2019 case, and including commitments on historic preservation, prohibited uses, and outdoor amenity space that Mr. Fred Belladin will explain in just a few moments. As noted in the staff report and Matt's presentation, the case is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the future land use map because the conditions mimic the mix of uses in that CX district, capitalize on transit access, and commit to significant historic preservation not seen elsewhere in this district. Next slide, please. The two inconsistencies noted, the lack of frontage and the height inconsistency, are present because a frontage would not be possible where historic buildings are on the property line, and we're trying to work with that historic preservation as our main goal and public interest that we're offering here. And with respect to height, this aerial shows Raleigh Union Station on the bottom left, the Dillon in the center, and the rezoning site in the red arrow. The area south of West Martin is currently 1 to 2 stories, which was consistent with the downtown West Gateway area plan and the height guidance in the Depot District when those plans were created in 2004. Next slide, please. But since that time, at least 5 zonings have been approved to be constructed in this area, all at significantly taller heights than either of these planning documents anticipated in order to meet the needs of our growing city. Several of those are shown here with the rezoning site highlighted in yellow, and sites in blue are zoned for 20 to 40 stories, including the Rust Bus facility, the CAM building, the anticipated Raleigh Municipal Building, and the old Firestone site directly across Dawson Street, which was rezoned earlier this year to allow for 40 stories. The sites directly north and south of this are also going through the process of 40-story designations. Next slide, please. This model illustrates what the surrounding area is expected to look like based on those rezonings by simulating a drone view from the northeast or over Nash Square. Our proposed 20 stories is the building in yellow, which is almost completely hidden behind what could be 40-story buildings on the east side of Dawson. Our historic preservation conditions are illustrated with the existing building fronting West Martin Street in gray and in front of the 20-story yellow building rendering to the rear. This really shows how much lower in height and significantly set back the buildings would be from the new construction would be from West Martin Street, and how we're preserving the warehouse scale much more forcefully than any of the surrounding zoning approvals. Next slide, please. In that context, the proposed zoning will provide for appropriately scaled gateway into the warehouse district, with the existing buildings remaining on Martin as anticipated in the 2019 zoning, and the parking lot behind them transformed into 20 stories for additional housing or office supply in the area. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Fred Belladin with Clearscapes to share more about the history of the site and the vision for the project, as well as the architectural conditions. Next slide, please. If Fred Belladin could be unmuted, please.
Thank you. Good morning, members of the commission. As Jamie noted, Clearscapes first brought this project to the Planning Commission in 2018. At that time, our founding partners, Steve Schuster and Thomas Sayer, had planned to self-develop the site. Our vision was to bring together the best of Raleigh's past and future by combining historic preservation with creative new infill around a thoughtfully designed urban public space. With Steve's passing, the Turnbridge team has now stepped in to help carry this vision forward. As Jamie noted, the scale of the development has grown a bit over time to reflect the evolution in the warehouse district, but our project vision remains the same. In this diagram, you can see the existing preserved buildings shown in white fronting Martin Street. You can see the infill building in yellow on the south end of the site, separated from the existing buildings. And together they frame an urban slot courtyard, which is indicative of so many of the character-driven spaces within the warehouse district
And with the expanded site footprint, we actually now have the opportunity to create a pedestrian cross access between Commerce Place and Dawson Street. Next slide, please. This slide is representative of the type of thoughtfully designed urban public spaces that we envision for this project. In most of these, you can see a combination of blending new and old around character-driven spaces that reflect the specifics of time and place. Next slide, please. And also, as Matt and Jamie pointed out, we feel that Martin Street is one of the most, if not the most, intact blocks within the historic Depot District, or Warehouse District as it's colloquially known. Here you can see the site in red with the arrow, and you can see the former Martin Street aqueduct on the lower left side. Next slide, please. This slide is actually from the NPS nomination. It just speaks in general to the character of these buildings. And while modest, they are an important part of the history of this area, which is why they are the focus of this project proposal. Next slide, please. And Matt did a good job outlining the zoning conditions, so I won't go into too much detail, but mostly provide some clarity. Condition 1 speaks to the commitment to preserve the existing structures. As Matt noted, the intent is to preserve the full depth of the existing buildings, as you saw in the previous slide. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that it's a very tight site, and it's possible that we may run into unforeseen site, subsurface, or access challenges as we get into the full design and engineering. To address this uncertainty, this condition commits to preserving a minimum of 85 feet of the existing buildings from Martin Street. I want to note that the 85 feet is not an arbitrary number. Each of the existing building bays has a different structural grid spacing, and 85 feet is the deepest point at which all of the grids in the buildings align. Items B and C outline the specific preservation commitments for the existing historic buildings. The earlier rezoning simply referenced National Park Service standards, which are interpretive in some way. So conditions B and C are revised here to spell out the preservation commitment in plain language, which is consistent with the National Park Service standards. Next slide, please. Condition 2, as Matt pointed out, comes into play only in the event of destruction or significant damage to the existing structures. This is a pretty common historic preservation approach, and the standard for damage being greater than 50% of the replacement cost of the structure is a standard historic preservation approach. So to be clear, this comes into play only if the structure is damaged beyond repair. In that case, any replacement would be limited to 5 stories, and it would be limited to materials that are consistent with the contributing structures currently found within the Depot National Register District. Next slide, please. And then finally, conditions 3, 4, and 5 are the non-historic preservation conditions. 3, as Matt outlined, limited uses. 4 was a staff request back in 2018 for our four-legged friends. And then finally, 5 is the commitment that a majority or a portion of our public plaza will be open to the public. With that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Jamie.
Thank you, Fred. If we could just flip to the next slide, this just illustrates how those conditions play out in a plan view. I think this is a good slide to rest on and take any questions that the commission may have. At the end of that discussion, we would respectfully request a recommendation for approval. Thank you.
Thank you. I do believe we have members of the public signed up to speak. If we can unmute the first speaker.
Yes, our speaker is Steve Lai.
Hi, Ray. Sorry, I just had to vote. Have no opinion at this time on this case.
Thank you, Mr. Lai. Are there any other members of the public signed up to speak on this item?
That's all we had.
Okay, excellent. Then we can shift to questions or comments from commissioners. Do any members of the commission have any questions or comments? Commissioner Dautel?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Fox. Yeah, I'd like to maybe ask the applicant to maybe clarify the discussion about applying a frontage. I think I understand the approach along Martin, but is it possible to add a frontage along Dawson Street, or I don't know, just any discussion about that decision would be helpful.
Thank you, Commissioner Dotel. This is Jamie Schwather. I'll start and then turn it over to Fred. I think most of our approach in this case was informed by this team's experience throughout the Creamery project, where we did have another significant historic preservation directly adjacent to new construction, and how when you have a block and have a portion of it designated with frontage and a portion not, we ran into some unforeseen difficulties. So at the zoning stage, trying to comply with the overall planning documents, and then running into some problems in terms of service. And so that really guided our vision here. We've also been working with the surrounding kind of property owners and reaching out, as well as working with the city on future visions on how some of these streetscapes could be materialized. And through those discussions and our interaction, decided that committing to a zoning condition or frontage in this situation might limit some of the creative things we would be able to do along the entire block face. Fred, I don't know if you want to add to that or contribute any other additional technical issues.
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. Great question, Brian. So as you correctly noted, fundamentally, the existing historic buildings do not meet frontage requirements. And by committing to preserve those existing buildings, we are additionally ceding the majority of our frontage for this site. So when we factor in access requirements for parking deck, transformer vaults, things like that, we are effectively having to work with very narrow constrained elevations, which preclude the ability to meet the transparency requirements associated with shopfront frontage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
To follow up on that, has the applicant considered additional treatment along the Dawson side at grade level?
Thank you, Chair Fox. We had looked at that area. Some of the uncertainty on Dawson Street is not going to be resolved until site plan, when we have direct feedback from DOT about our access issues. We have reached out and initiated those conversations, but as I believe the Commission's aware, a TIA was not required for this situation, as it is in normal course for these types of requests. And so DOT is not giving us a clear answer on access until we go through that process. So like the frontage, we are evaluating the ways in which we can return to the real core of this case and carry the historic preservation conditions forward in a meaningful way. And in order to do that, we have to have some flexibility on some of these other code provisions in order to make sure that we not only have historic buildings that can function, but they can be serviced and the access is appropriate. And so we're really trying to focus on that historic component.
And just to follow up on that a little bit, it looked, based on the concept plans, the majority of public amenity space is maintaining that pedestrian corridor from Martin between the two buildings, and then across access east-west from Dawson to Commerce. Is that accurate?
That's right. There is that public space commitment condition, and Fred showed several precedent images of how we believe those treatments could play out. Fred, if you could address the significant topo changes and challenges as you go from east to west, I think that'll also explain some of the difficulties we had in applying what you normally might see in other zoning cases to this case.
Sure. There's roughly a 10 to 13 foot grade change from Dawson Street running west across the site to Commerce Place. And similarly, there's roughly a 1-story grade change from Martin Street up to the center of this site. So the deck, as you saw in the diagrams, is very carefully located to fit within the site parameters. And as Jamie alluded to, we are preserving access opportunities from any of the streets pending further conversations with NCDOT. So as we're able to finalize an access strategy that works for NCDOT and the city, we'll have a better idea of how to address all of these other conditions. But currently, until we start that full design and engineering process, we simply don't have the information available.
Thank you for that.
And just to follow up, that's typical at this stage in the zoning process. Just to be clear, it's not that we haven't gone through those things. We've kind of pushed them to as far as we can in the zoning context, and then designed the conditions in a way that will enable us to keep that pedestrian passage open and have some creative treatments. Both the intent is to have creative treatments both on Commerce and on Dawson, but we need DOT's kind of permission essentially to make sure all of that can happen and the service requirements are met as well.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yes, thanks, Chair Fox. I did have one question. I think I just want to confirm what I heard. And of course, knowing the work that the applicant, both through the developer and through the architect, do in their portfolio, saving the preservation of the existing buildings, all of that stuff is fantastic. But did I hear Mr. Belladin say, or maybe it was Ms. Schwedler, that there are no conditions, I don't see them, about at least the type of materials? I certainly understand the frontage and the fact that we're preserving buildings along Martin and really having to look at the site as a whole with topo and utilities and putting a lot in there. So I understand that. But I feel like on other cases, we've at least talked about the ground floor materials along Dawson, or, along other thoroughfares. I believe actually there was one case that we heard on Dawson that we did ask the applicant to consider at least spelling out some of the materials. I'm not as concerned about the frontage, but it's a major thoroughfare. And did I hear correctly that that is not included in the conditions? I don't read them, but I could be missing it.
Yes, Brian, this is Jamie Schwedler. Some of those other cases I think you're referencing are really distinguishable from what we're doing here, because most of the cases that have come forward in this area, and we checked back through in the last year or so, most of them are a complete scrape of the block and going up to 40 stories. And so those conditions are appropriate in order to make sure there's some control and expectation about what this will look like and how it will emulate the warehouse district and be appropriate fit in the downtown district. And we believe that the major distinguishing factor here is the significant preservation, not just of a facade, not just of a material palette, but of the entire buildings up to an 85-foot minimum depth, hopefully more, are really just totally distinguish this from anything else you all have seen in this area in the past few years. And for that reason, we'd really like to focus the kind of prescriptive conditions on that to celebrate the warehouse district and leave some flexibility for the remaining portion of the site. That said, I appreciate you noting this design team's prowess, because they do have a significant commitment and have made good faith efforts in the creamery, and we fully intend to expect that will continue to have the flexibility to do something that is contextually appropriate when juxtaposed with the preserved buildings.
Thank you for that, Jamie. I guess my question is, and I'm thinking back actually about the case just up the block here. I believe it was a Highwoods rezoning where they wanted to do something similar and remove the shop front, and we just had some concerns and went through a couple of meetings and talking with staff about removing that frontage, what it could allow along some of the streets. And so again, praising the efforts and acknowledging the complications that come with preserving the historic buildings. And again, everything needs to be put on there. I guess my question to staff is, and I'll just use an extreme, but I mean, is there an opportunity removing the shop front along Dawson that we could have blank walls along Dawson? I guess that kind of is partly my concern. And again, I feel like we went through at least 2 meetings on a previous rezoning where the applicant wanted to remove shop frontage, and we were able to come back and add some conditions that got the applicant to sort of where they wanted to be, but gave the city some assurances that there would be the proper transparencies and access and no blank walls, et cetera, but I might be misremembering that.
Brian, this is Fred. I'm happy to jump in and try to help here. So as an example, on Dawson Street, with the preservation commitments, our total building width is about 120 feet wide max, which is the width of a standard 2-tray deck. So as an example, if we end up needing to place all of our access points off of Dawson, that would be a 30-foot garage entrance. It would be a 30-foot transformer bay. So right there, half of the building would be required to be designated for service. Now, obviously, those would be transparent service points with roll-up doors and things. But that's an example of why we struggle trying to craft a condition that would be amenable to allowing for this flexibility moving forward. For instance, if we end up working access points on Commerce, that could change. But that's the difficulty of trying to craft a condition. But to answer your question, no, I don't think we'll have blank walls, extensive blank walls on either of the Commerce or the Dawson frontages, simply because we're going to need to poke holes for access in those two locations.
So
Sure. We'll go ahead and Ken, sorry.
Just one thing. So the urban frontages do a few things. One is the build to shop front requires a taller floor to ceiling height on the ground floor so as to accommodate retail. Urban limited, urban general do not. But the other thing is that the design standards for parking decks are included as for urban frontages. And by not including an urban frontage nor any conditions, there are no design standards essentially for parking decks. So that's one thing that you would be that's being lost because there's no frontage here. Obviously, that can be dealt with through conditions or not, in lieu of the frontage being applied. We understand the applicant's concern about being able to meet the full build to percentage because the service entrances and uses have to go somewhere on this site, and you could certainly make an argument that Martin Street is more important pedestrian corridor than Dawson Street is. It's lower volume of traffic, it's more comfortable, it goes directly to Union Station and connects Nash Square. I think that's a very strong argument that if you have to put service history somewhere, they shouldn't go on Martin Street. Also, they're preserving the historic buildings, so they can't physically go there. On the other hand, there are some standards in the code that are linked to urban frontages that are not being applied here as a result.
Thanks, Ken. And we do know that the text change about parking deck screening is making its way through the process, and we are following that. I think given all of the complications that Fred described, it makes it very difficult to make commitments at this stage when we're balancing all of those competing interests. And really think the appropriate vehicle is to let that text change come through and apply to this property as it would with the full benefit of public discourse and council approval. And so that's where we're wrestling with how to really carry this vision forward historically, recognize the constraints of the site with the buildings literally on the property line, and balance all of those things together in order to bring this forward. And again, I can't stress enough how different this is from the other cases, even with the orientation of the new construction, not only being set back, but having these kind of narrower exposures on Dawson Street, which is a one-way street to the south. And so we're talking about a very different potential parking deck screening face than we were on other cases. That said, I know this team is very much in their interest to make sure that this is an attractive building and that we'll do the appropriate thing as we move forward.
Question for staff. Do we have a sense of the timeline for the text change for parking deck screening?
We may have to get you that information. I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yeah, I'm fully in support of this project. I feel like if we're going to be consistent, which we talked quite a bit about, we have at least tried to craft conditions to, but I understand that this current team is focused and working to preserve and do the right thing. But as we've mentioned before, this project could be sold. There's no condition there. They're adding conditions to preserve the building. So obviously that would need to be adhered to. I just feel like there might be an opportunity to work with staff to take a look at crafting some conditions. Dawson is a major thoroughfare, and fully support and trust and understand the current team. I don't know that that protects the city in the future, and I feel like we've hit pause for a moment on several other cases, and maybe the applicant is correct that this is a different condition, but I just feel like we haven't done this in the past, just to fully remove the frontage and say, okay, you know, hopefully we do the right thing. So it's just my current thinking. I wanted to throw that out for some other commissioners' thoughts on that.
Thank you for your comments. I'm seeing a significant amount of nods as well. I will get to hands in a moment. What I'm thinking is perhaps we defer this case to get a little bit more clarity about the timeline of the text change for parking deck screening, because that would have a significant impact on this case, and perhaps allow the applicant additional time to discuss that timeline with staff. I saw, oh, go ahead, Mr. Bowers.
Just to say, yeah, I think we some additional time to put together a little information on the status of that. It's the current status, though, as we've been able to uncover right now, is that it's still in drafting. It has not formally entered the process yet for review. So I'm not in a position to even entirely speak to the contents of it. So other than that, it's implementing recommendations of a report that was done by the Urban Design Center looking at parking deck design. So with that, that's all I can offer with you right now.
Thank you. And Commissioner Bennett, I saw your hand raised.
Thank you. I was just going to say that I agreed with Commissioner O'Haver. I think it's important to be consistent. And you know, he brought that case back to my memory, and we did go back and forth a couple meetings to get that those conditions in for the parking deck screening. So I would support deferring this to allow the applicant to at least consider some sort of conditions.
Thank you. And Commissioner Dattel.
Thanks. Yeah, I was kind of echo Commissioner Bennett's comments there. Nothing to add.
Thank you. Without objection, then, I'd like to defer this case to our next meeting, which I believe is March 8th, to allow the applicant a little bit additional time and to get some clarity regarding the timeline of the text change for parking deck screening. Okay, seeing no objection. That concludes all of the discussion items on our agenda. And next is the approval of the minutes. The draft minutes for the February 8th Planning Commission meeting are included in the backup. Are there any edits or comments related to the minutes? Commissioner Bennett?
There was just one thing near the end of the minutes during the report of the commissioners. I had asked a question about how staff directs applicants to deal with low English proficiency, how applicants notice people in the communities as well as engage with them. And I believe Ken said that he wasn't sure, but he would come back with that information. So I just didn't see that in the minutes. So if that could just be added, then I'm fine with the minutes.
Excellent. With that technical addition, I would like to offer a motion to approve the meeting minutes. Do I have a second? Second from Commissioner Bennett. Is there any additional discussion or debate about the merits of the motion and the approval of the meeting minutes? Seeing none, I will ask for a show of hands to record vote. Those in favor of approving the minutes? Any opposed? The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to other business, I have no report today other than what I believe is going to be brought up during a report of the Deputy Director regarding going back to in-person meetings. So I'll hold for that and move on to report of members. Do any members have a report? Commissioner Miller?
Thank you. I just noticed an issue that had a calendar reminder pop up that we made about a year ago. So I just wanted to address it. And I just was looking back at the history. I think in March or April of last year, the Planning Commission and City Council passed text change 1620 regarding floodplain regulations. That text change limited the amount of development allowed in residential lots and other properties located in various floodplain maps. And those floodplain maps are based largely or are based on the FEMA floodplain maps. And at that time, the affected property owners received or would receive targeted notice of the text change and how it would affect their property. One concern we had at that time was that the FEMA maps were set to be updated at an unknown future date, and that those new FEMA maps could potentially create new lots subject to the development limitations when the owners had not received notice of the changes. So we tried to mitigate that concern by setting an effective date for the text change to a point where after the FEMA maps would be published. But of course, at the time, there was no certainty about when those maps would be finalized. So as a result, when we passed the text change last year, we include a recommendation that we revisit the issue in January or February of this year, once the new floodplain maps are published by FEMA. And I just noticed in February, the last month, FEMA did finalize its new floodplain maps for Wake County, and the new maps are going to become effective in July of this year. I'm sure staff is already evaluating this issue, but I wanted to ask to see if staff at a future meeting, either at a text change meeting or to the full Planning Commission, if they could provide a brief update on the effective date of the new maps, the effective date of that text change, and whether any additional notice would be required or any other changes that staff might recommend for us. Mr. York? Oh, sorry, Chair.
Yes, staff is aware of it. We anticipate an item on the City Council agenda for March 1st to bring that to the Council's attention with a recommendation to defer the effective date until later in July. And so we believe that matter is being brought to Council's attention at their next meeting.
Thank you. That's good news. Are there any additional reports from members that may or may not include meetings which may or may not occur this Thursday at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock? Commissioner Bennett?
Well, since you put it that way, the Infrastructure and Mobility Committee will be meeting this Thursday at 3 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I believe we have a committee of the whole meeting directly after that on Thursday. And then Commissioner Miller?
Yes, I'd also like to add the Text Change Committee is going to have a special meeting on Tuesday, March 1st from 4 to 6 p.m. That will occur on our virtual environment that we've been using most recently.
Thank you. And Commissioner Lampman?
I'll just follow up. I don't have anything for the Strategic Planning Committee for the next month. So if there's any topics that we feel would warrant deeper discussion, I'm happy to take those on. And just wanted to say thank you to Ira for your presentation last week that went over the application process. It was very informative, and we appreciated your time and attention to that and educating us and potentially new committee members. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Without objection, I'm going to move on to the report of the Deputy Planning Director, Mr. Bowers.
Sure, I'll hit a few highlights. The Bagwell Avenue and Hillsborough Street case, which was a split vote, is still in process, and public hearing has been continued to the next to the council meeting on March 1st, we expect the allowed height to come down and other amendments to the conditions. There are parking minimums and maximums, all the hard work the planning commission did on that text change we've all received. So the version that you recommended is the version that's going to public hearing, and it's going to public hearing on March 15th. All your other items that were reported out have been approved for public hearings for April 5th. March is starting to get busy, and we want to provide ample time for notice for some of those. There'll be a city-initiated rezoning coming your way at some point in the coming weeks for some city-owned properties that are in the Dix Edge plan study area, even though that plan is still under revision and hasn't gone into the adoption process. Given the rapid change in the neighborhoods, staff thought it important to move quickly to try to provide some affordable housing opportunities on sites that we control. So that'll be coming towards you. I'll get to the in-person meetings kind of last. There is a memo attached to the report on this on the Soul Smart designation process, which is about highlighting solar-friendly communities. Our current planning manager, Lisa Bailey Taylor, has done an analysis in that memo and showed that we meet the criteria for that designation. And so we'll be putting in an application in conjunction, working with the Office of Sustainability. One thing that's not on the report that I think will have some future ramifications is there was a motion made by Mayor Pro Tem Stewart at the last council meeting, directing staff to report back on changing the way we look at traffic impacts for developments. And I think this is some ideas that have already been percolating at the staff level, and now we have clear direction from council. There was a recent ULI program about the California experience where they've gone in their environmental quality laws from looking at level of service, which is essentially what is the delay at nearby intersections when you build a project, to VMT, vehicle miles traveled, which is sort of a more holistic look at how much travel is added to the region's road network by different types of projects. Long story short, typically building in infill locations where stuff is close at hand has a low VMT impact, but may have a higher level of service impact, whereas building out in the hinterland typically has a very low level of service impact, but a very high VMT impact. So if you take this different perspective on traffic impacts, you'll end up with very different views. VMT is probably more closely aligned with the cities and other cities in the region's climate goals, because the amount of emissions from vehicles is very closely related to how much they're in circulation, which is what VMT is trying to measure. So at this point, there'll be no immediate change to our procedures in terms of how we look at them, traffic impacts of the rezoning phase, but I think this is setting the stage for a potential shift looking at that in the future. But the first step is to report back to council on some options and receive some additional direction. Then the last item is return to in-person meetings. So the council has decided to return to in-person meetings in March, and so the other boards and commissions are to follow in conjunction with talking with Chair Fox. Decision is that Planning Commission will return to in-person meetings beginning with your regularly scheduled meeting on March 22nd. And so we'll prepare for that if there's any questions you have regarding protocols. But at this point, the return to in-person meetings means that the entire meeting, including all public comment, will be handled in person. So with that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. Are there any questions for Mr. Bowers, since we have him here, or anything else for the good of the order? Commissioner Miller?
Wondering if we had an update about the committee to evaluate the Planning Commission bylaws.
Yes, and this is Travis. Happy to chime in here. We've been coordinating dates. I've been working with the chairperson and vice chairperson on a date. I think the consensus is that we've got a Friday meeting lined up for that. I've not heard back from all of the selected members, but we've tentatively put on the calendar for this Friday to have a meeting and a presentation on that topic.
Yeah, Travis, I hadn't heard back from Commissioner Raines. And so once I do, I think Commissioner Miller, you wanted to do Thursday. So Travis, maybe Thursday might be better, but I hadn't heard back from Commissioner Raines on that.
We could potentially meet this Thursday. I would need to know almost immediately because we need 48 hours to publish for the meeting. So Friday gives us a little bit more wiggle room. We could do Thursday, but I would need to know essentially now.
Okay, all right. Well, let me check with Commissioner Raines again after we log off, and then I will reach back out to Commissioner Miller and Commissioner Fox to make sure we can make Friday work.
That sounds perfect. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Any additional items for the good of the order? Okay, seeing none, that concludes this meeting of the Planning Commission. Thanks, everybody.